Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to the velvet-draped bedrooms and mahogany chambers of Victorian England, where the night doesn't begin with Netflix or melatonin gummies, but with a firm handshake, a velvet robe, and an astonishingly early decision to shut out the sun. Imagine this. It's mid-afternoon in a sprawling London townhouse, and the gentleman of the house is already closing the drapes. Heavy velvet ones, mind you, so thick they could double as castle ramparts. The sun, barely past its peak, is cast out like an unwanted solicitor. The room darkens with theatrical flair, and the candles, gas lamps, or perhaps even the first flicker of electricity, are summoned not for romance, but for rest. Yes, your host is preparing for an evening nap. And no, this isn't unusual. You're in the heart of 19th century upper-class routine, where daylight and decency have an awkward relationship. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the parlor, and it's already dim as dusk. The curtains are closed, not because it's nighttime, but because it's not. Direct sunlight, according to many a Victorian manual, was a dangerous intrusion, particularly for the delicate minds of scholarly men. Sunlight overstimulates the nerves, one pamphlet warns. Best let the mind rest in darkness for half the day. You pause. This man has essentially declared war on noon. This wasn't some fringe behavior. Among the British upper crust, especially the men who didn't need to be in offices or on horses, controlling light and darkness became part of one's identity. It's less early to bed, early to rise, and more. Rise when the house stops creaking and return to bed before the cat yawns. Victorian gentlemen, especially the fussy, academic, or aristocratic kind, believed in retiring not once, but multiple times per day. A typical pattern might go like this. Wake around 10, stare wistfully out a rain-streaked window, take coffee in total silence, retreat 4, a half hour of mind stillness, translation nap, reappear for a heavily buttered meal, read poetry aloud to a dog, and then vanish once again for a digestive recline. By mid-afternoon, many would insist on total quiet. Households were trained to respect this contemplative window. Children were hushed. Pianos were silenced. You can almost hear the ticking of a grandfather clock echoing down a hallway like a cannon. Historians still argue whether this midday nap culture was rooted in true fatigue, social signaling, or sheer boredom. Was it a health habit or a performance of refinement? Either way, the result was a world in which rest became more theatrical than sleep itself. Of course, it wasn't just about the nap. It was about where and how you did it. Many gentlemen curated specific rooms for their early retreats. Not bedrooms, but resting chambers. These were stocked with soft velvet chairs angled just so, footstools for precise elevation, and cabinets containing tinctures of lavender, tonics of quinine, or even early sleeping drafts made with laudanum, which, fun fact, is both opium and a terrible idea. It was also considered critical to sleep without vulgarity. No snoring, no tossing, certainly no sleeping in one's shirt sleeves. Gentlemen would often dress in a second set of robes for midday sleep, embroidered, scented, and often absurd. One count reportedly had his afternoon robe shipped from Paris and scented with violet oil. He then changed again before dinner into something less restful but equally useless. Here's the kicker. Many of these same men claimed they struggled with sleep. Why? Well, perhaps because their sleep habits were designed less for comfort and more for performative dignity. Sleep was a statement. A midday nap wasn't a luxury. It was a moral position. You weren't just tired. You were sensitive. You were overwhelmed by the cruel glare of day. You were intellectually fatigued from contemplating Roman sculpture for 15 whole minutes before breakfast. You glance around the room. A clock ticks behind layers of damask. A fireplace smolders, despite it being July. There's a book of Horace left open on a chaise. But no one is reading it, because the man of the house has withdrawn, meaning he's in the next room, asleep in a position that resembles a fainting duchess more than a grown adult. Meanwhile, downstairs, the staff tiptoe through routines designed to avoid waking His Reclining Highness. A teacup must not rattle. A stair must not creak. If they do, well, he'll write a letter. A long, trembling letter to the editor of the Times about how the working classes have no respect for restorative solitude. And here's the twist. Many of these men did this despite having terrible sleep at night. Their schedules were tangled spaghetti bowls of rest, wakefulness, and awkward pauses. One physician in 1863 noted that many gentlemen claimed to sleep 4 hours at night and make up the balance in intervals of civilized slumber. Civilized slumber. Imagine trying to pitch that as your excuse for being late to work today. There's something slightly theatrical, even camp about it all. But that's Victorian masculinity for you. Equal parts repression and embroidered slippers. You're not just watching a man nap. You're witnessing a declaration of identity, woven in linen and lemon-scented pomade. So now you're sitting there, in this quietly breathing house, wondering what's next. Is he waking up? Not yet. The bells haven't chimed, and the hallway runner hasn't been warmed by foot traffic. No Victorian gentleman rises until the floors are less cold than his attitude. Instead, you lean back in the brocade chair. Outside, a horse clops somewhere. Inside, not a single soul stirs. The nap continues, not just a sleep, but a ritual. And you, sleepy listener, are just getting started. You're still perched politely in the parlor when the door creaks open just a fraction. Out glides the gentleman, or rather, he wafts, as if gravity is a lower-class concern. He's exchanged his earlier lounging robe for something marginally more formal. A quilted nightgown in pale blue, with mother-of-pearl buttons that catch the candlelight. On his head, a pointed cap, silk of course, with an embroidered monogram and tassel that swings with the gentle swagger of someone who believes he has just woken from a dream of historical significance. And now, we must talk about nightwear. Not for children, not for invalids, but for men. Those same top-hatted, stiff-collared symbols of industrial might and stoicism. Victorian gentlemen took their sleep attire very seriously, in part because it was another opportunity to reinforce one's rank, taste, and adherence to an absurd number of rules. The idea of sleepwear as a style statement wasn't new, but Victorian England elevated it to an art form. The classic image of a man in a long shirt and nightcap is rooted in this era, but that's just the beginning. Gentlemen could spend small fortunes on what they wore to bed, or more accurately, what they wore before bed, in bed, for reading in bed, and even for pacing dramatically around the bed. Mainstream historical records confirm the proliferation of elaborate night sets for men, complete with nightshirts, embroidered naturally, dressing gowns, preferably silk, lined with velvet, nightcaps, sometimes perfumed, and soft-soled slippers for the midnight glide to the study or water closet. It was a miniature wardrobe for an activity where, ideally, no one saw you, except, of course, the valet, or the butler, or the poor maid tasked with setting the bed warmer into the coals. Historians still argue whether these outlandish sleep outfits were more about genuine comfort or the expectation of being unexpectedly admired, even while unconscious. A guest might pop by. A neighbor might collapse nearby. You wouldn't want to be caught dreaming in cotton like a commoner. You, meanwhile, are now trailing the gentleman as he shuffles softly into the breakfast room. No, it's not morning. It's 8:30 p.m., but after his second nap and a change of clothing, he prefers a light snack before beginning the descent into night. This often means toast cut into aggressively neat triangles, a poached egg served with alarming reverence, and perhaps a cup of beef tea. Yes, beef tea. Exactly what it sounds like. Broth passed off as a beverage and consumed with the sleepy pride of someone who believes it's medicinal. Nightwear at table? Not unusual. In private settings, it was seen as casual refinement. Some gentlemen even entertained in sleepwear, especially if the guests were other gentlemen in equally ornate robes. The effect was like a pajama party hosted by a parliament. Some sleepwear designs were even customized to align with a man's philosophical leanings. Stoic gentlemen wore somber gray flannel. Romantic poets favored flowing white cotton with wide sleeves and loose sashes. One naturalist in Devon insisted on a moss-colored robe with fern embroidery, so he might better merge with the natural world and dream. He also slept with a hedgehog once, but that's another section. There were guides to night attire, whole booklets on what to wear while retiring. The Gentleman's Nocturnal Companion, 1869, advised against colors of too loud a nature, as they might disturb the repose of the subconscious. It also warned against rough linens, unshaped socks, and mirthful prints, which, apparently, could corrupt the moral spine through dreams. Of course, not everyone adhered to these unwritten codes. Some men took pride in sleeping as plainly as possible, insisting it proved their rugged virility. One earl famously slept in nothing but a wool blanket and a single glove. Why the glove? No one knows, but it was monogrammed, and that's what matters. Still others flirted with spiritualism through sleepwear. Pale violet gowns for dream enhancement, blue silk stitched with celestial symbols. An astronomer in Sussex reportedly stitched the phases of the moon into his robe, claiming it inspired subconscious calculations. Whether it worked or not is unclear. He did, however, once wake up convinced he was a telescope. Then there was the curious case of gentlemen who wore formal wear to sleep. A niche practice, sure, but one that emerged among a specific breed of dandy who feared being seen underdressed under any circumstance, even while unconscious. One account describes a man who wore a velvet waistcoat over his nightshirt and kept a cravat loosely tied, lest death visit and find him indecent. Genuinely, there were fears of being discovered dead without sartorial dignity. And what of the famous nightcap? Not just for cartoons or Ebenezer Scrooge. In an age when bedrooms were often unheated, the head became a battleground for comfort. Nightcaps were thought to retain the vapor of thought, whatever that means, and were lined in flannel or even fur. Some had bells, others tragic little pom-poms. Still others were passed down like heirlooms. One aristocrat claimed his had been worn by 6 generations of lightly insomniac viscounts. You, now standing in the threshold of the study, watch as the gentleman removes his slippers and exchanges his robe for yet another, slightly softer version. It's bedtime. Again, though it's unclear whether this will involve any sleeping. He kneels briefly, not to pray, but to adjust a heating pan tucked under the mattress. Then, as he climbs beneath a positively excessive number of sheets, you hear the tiniest sigh of satisfaction. There is ritual here. There is rhythm. And there is something deeply funny about how much effort is required to pretend that none of this is effortful. As the gaslight dims and the gentleman finally settles into something approximating rest, you reflect on what you've seen. Clothes meant not to be seen. Schedules based on not needing a schedule. Entire fabrics invented for the purpose of being crumpled in sleep. And perhaps, just perhaps, your own pajamas suddenly feel underwhelming. The gaslight flickers low, and the gentleman seems to be drifting at last. But don't get too cozy. He won't be asleep for long, because Victorian slumber didn't just happen once per night. It came in fragments, often sandwiched between inexplicably scheduled activities. And now, as the clock approaches 11:30 p.m., it's time for his supper. Yes, supper, not dinner. That already happened, sort of, during the early evening. But many Victorian gentlemen reserved their most indulgent meals for late into the night, long after others had curled under quilts and called it a day. You creep down the stairs and find the dining room lit once again. The heavy curtains remain shut tight, of course. It's as if sunlight itself has been exiled from the premises. The table is set with quiet grandeur. Fine china, a modest roast, a bowl of pickled walnuts, and if he's feeling ambitious, oysters. This is not a snack. This is a slow, meticulous, wine-accompanied experience. Your host settles in, still wrapped in a nightgown, and eats with the slow precision of someone who has nowhere else to be, and hasn't for years. Why such late dining? Historians still argue whether it was a class performance, the luxury of choosing your meal times, or linked to long-standing traditions of second sleep. In pre-industrial times, many people practiced segmented sleep, a first sleep after dusk, then waking around midnight for an hour or two before drifting into a second phase. For some Victorians, This model lingered, though now it came with mutton. You sit in silence, the silverware tapping gently on porcelain. Outside, the London fog presses against the window panes like a curious ghost. The room feels timeless. The gentleman dabs his mouth with a napkin the size of a picnic blanket. Then he pours a second glass of claret and reads aloud, quietly, to himself. It's a guide to agricultural reform. You try not to take it personally. This whole meal could last over an hour, and it's just one part of his nocturnal loop. It's here that the Victorian gentleman comes most alive, somewhere between roast beef and philosophical musing. Diaries of the era record these odd mealtime habits in great detail. One barrister in 1887 claimed he did his finest thinking between midnight and 2 a.m. while nibbling cold pigeon pie. Another aristocrat, widowed and lonely, invited himself to his own late suppers with the kind of melancholy flair you could bottle and sell in a poetry shop. Of course, this midnight dining required a delicate dance with the kitchen staff. Meals had to be pre-prepared, reheated with care, and served without fanfare. Cooks learned to organize quiet trays, which could be left just outside the gentleman's study or brought to the drawing room with a knock so soft it barely registered in the human ear. And it wasn't just food. There were drinks, too. Medicinal cordials, night tonics, and something politely called sleep drafts. These concoctions often included a disturbing blend of alcohol, herbs, and light narcotics. One such drink, recommended in a popular health guide, contained port wine mixed with valerian root and just a touch of opium. A gentle nightcap, if you will. Another favorite, milk punch, which involved warm milk, nutmeg, rum, and the self-assurance that this wouldn't come back to haunt you at 3 a.m. But here's where it gets stranger. Some gentlemen kept journals, specifically for their post-supper reflections. These weren't business notes or drafts of novels. They were dream prequels, pages written while the body was still warm from roast fowl and the mind was beginning to swim gently into sleep's waiting arms. Tonight, I feel the moon pressing on my temples, one wrote. I believe I shall dream of giraffes again. Yes, giraffes. Again. You glance at your host. His plate is now clean. His posture slack. He sips the final ounce of his cordial and closes the agricultural journal with a sigh of epic proportions, as though the fate of wheat itself now rests in his subconscious. He rises gracefully, if a bit wobbly, and disappears into the hallway. You follow, of course, through the dim halls, past the grandfather clock, ticking with judgmental precision. The night is far from over. In fact, this next bit is what many gentlemen would consider their actual bedtime. It's around 1:30 a.m. now. Just enough time for one last read. Back in the bedroom, if you can call it that, since it looks more like a small museum of blankets. The gentleman selects a book from the shelf. Something dense. Roman history, perhaps. Or a botanical catalog. Or, if he's feeling rebellious, poetry translated from Sanskrit. He reads slowly, aloud just enough to hear the shape of the words. This ritual isn't for comprehension, it's a sedative. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that reading before bed was one of the few habits consistent across class lines during the Victorian era. But gentlemen took it to absurd lengths. Some timed their reading with sandglasses. Others annotated their books with marks indicating at what stage of sleepiness each passage should be read. Page 54. One wrote, for mild yawning. Page 72. The brink. Not all reading was practical. One man kept a log of the dullest passages he could find, purely for their narcotic effect. A 6-page treatise on tulip bulb measurements once sent him into a deep sleep for 10 hours. He framed it. Historians still debate whether this obsession with nighttime reading was born from sincere literary engagement or if it was simply the only socially acceptable way for a man to hold a stuffed toy and not get mocked. You turn back to the bed. The gentleman has finally returned to it. He lies not sprawled but placed, carefully as a bookmark in the night. 2 pillows, 1 blanket, 1 warming pan, now cooling at the foot. He closes his eyes, and then, with the same solemnity that a priest reserves for benedictions, he whispers, "Let the brain wander where it will." And with that, he sleeps. Kind of. You're not quite sure how long it's been. Maybe 20 minutes? Maybe 2 hours. The room is still. The house is quiet. You're beginning to feel the heaviness of sleep yourself when clunk, a noise. Somewhere near the bed. The gentleman stirs. You freeze. He's not waking. Not exactly. He's moving. Upright now, but not alert. His eyes remain closed. His feet shuffle onto the carpet with the delicacy of someone trying not to wake himself. You, sleepy observer, are now witnessing one of the oddest quirks of Victorian nightlife, the midnight wander. Yes, Victorian gentlemen didn't always stay tucked in after their post-supper slumbers. Sleepwalking, or nocturnal ambulation, was a known phenomenon, treated alternately as a medical mystery and a spiritual gift. In some households, it was even seen as a sign of intellectual vigor, because, of course, even your unconscious habits had to be a little pretentious. And while today's sleepwalkers might just end up in the kitchen, Victorian gentlemen roamed strangely. Take the Earl of X, who, in 1871, was discovered writing letters in his sleep. Full ink, careful handwriting, only to wake up with no memory and a pen cap tucked into his mustache. Or the case of the Oxford professor, who took to dream reading, mumbling entire passages of Aristotle while drifting from room to room with a candle in one hand and a pair of spectacles in the other, upside down. Tonight, your host glides toward the window, still heavily draped, muttering something about unexamined taxonomies. He pauses near a set of shelves, rearranges 3 books by height, not by title, and shuffles on. You follow barefoot, keeping your own breathing quiet, so as not to interrupt this dream ballet. This might sound like fringe behavior, but here's the mainstream fact. Victorian medicine took sleepwalking quite seriously. Medical journals of the time often included elaborate case studies of men who built model railways in their sleep, who debated politics while dozing, and in one curious case, who completed a full evening of accounting without waking once. He even balanced the books. Scholars of the time couldn't agree on what caused it. Nervous excess, one doctor suggested. Incomplete digestion, said another. The more spiritual circles suggested it was the soul temporarily freed to roam. Some even believed it was a form of divine inspiration, dreaming with legs. One fringe pamphlet, Somnus, the nocturnal philosopher, proposed that sleepwalkers were the next step in human evolution. These were men who had mastered the art of doing even less while appearing productive. Sounds like some managers you've known. Naturally, not every gentleman appreciated these midnight exhibitions. Sleepwalking came with risks. Falls, burns, impolite midnight urination into ornamental vases. As a result, bedrooms were often designed with precautions. Chairs turned sideways to trip the foot. Rugs folded slightly to create a toe-stub barrier. In one extraordinary household, the master slept inside a velvet-walled nook with a discreet chain curtain that would jingle if disturbed, like a very polite alarm system. And then there's the question of chamber pots. Yes, we've arrived at the part of Victorian sleep few want to picture, but cannot avoid. Indoor plumbing was still spotty across much of England, and even the wealthiest homes relied on chamber pots for nighttime relief. These pots, decorated, porcelain, occasionally gilded, were placed under the bed or in nearby cabinets called commodes. It was the valet's job to clean them, a job which, frankly, deserves hazard pay and a statue. Gentlemen were expected to use these discreetly, the key word being expected. But in reality, many wandered groggily through their rooms, sometimes relieving themselves wherever the urge struck, especially if sleepwalking. One noted naturalist reportedly mistook a hat stand for a urinal. The hat never recovered. You tiptoe behind your host as he approaches his cabinet. Thankfully, this time he's lucid enough to manage the chamber pot without error. He fumbles slightly with the lid, yawns once in a tone-deaf baritone, and then proceeds with the sort of routine you'll politely pretend not to have seen. Moments later, he stumbles back to bed, not gracefully, not with the earlier elegance, but like a man who's halfway between a dream and a rug. But the house isn't still yet. Somewhere down the hall, another door creaks. The staff. Servants were often required to remain semi-awake through the night, not just in case of fires or emergencies, but to assist their employers with their elaborate, unpredictable night needs. Water had to be kept at the right temperature, blankets fetched, candles relit. One butler in 1864 recorded being called 6 times between midnight and dawn, twice to adjust curtain folds, once to warm slippers, and once to chase a perceived ghost, which turned out to be a dressing gown hung too creatively. You crouch behind a parlor door as a servant glides past with a covered tray, possibly more tea, possibly just warm milk, a sleepy offering, an insurance policy against yet another sleepless hour. The staff aren't angry. They're simply exhausted and trained to hide it behind perfect posture and quiet feet. Historians still debate whether the sleepwalking and late-night rituals of Victorian men were born of actual restlessness or carefully constructed drama. Was it biology or the burden of appearing always important, even in unconsciousness? Regardless, the result was a fractured kind of night, one not defined by peaceful rest, but by performance, interruption, and the oddity of wandering half-dressed through hallways lined with taxidermy and oil portraits that seem to follow you. Your host has returned to bed now. Again, this time he clutches a small, leather-bound notebook, his dream diary. He'll try to record whatever fragments survive the next unconscious swirl of thoughts, snacks, and soft panic about taxes. You settle back into the corner, wrapped in shadows. The house groans gently with age. Another candle gutters. The pot is back under the bed, restored like a terrible relic. Everything is quiet again. For now, you rise quietly with the house, or rather, with the part of the house that never quite slept. It's now approaching 4:30 a.m., and once again, the gentleman stirs, not groggily, not confused, but with the crisp sense of purpose you'd expect from someone headed to a duel, not another bedtime snack. This, dear listener, is napping culture at its most refined, not the accidental dose of exhaustion, but a system of scheduled collapses, all perfectly timed for dignity. And where better to execute this high art than in the gentleman's club? You follow him, not outdoors, perish the thought, but to a private chamber that mimics those clubs, polished mahogany, stiff leather chairs, and silence so complete you can hear a drop of brandy think about falling. It's not the typical club you imagine. No billiards, no boisterous chatter. This is the nap room, and yes, it's real. Victorian gentlemen's clubs often had repose lounges, where distinguished men, judges, barristers, bankers, could gently snooze upright while appearing deeply engaged in the editorial section of the Times. Even in their sleep, they postured. In London alone, clubs like the Athenaeum, Reform, and Travelers were notorious for these hidden corners, where yawns were stifled with dignity and dreams, if acknowledged, had Latin footnotes. Snoring was tolerated, but only if it sounded authoritative. You watch as your gentleman reclines in his personal equivalent of such a space. A chair so firm it must have been invented by someone with a grudge against the spine, yet just soft enough to allow civilized fatigue. A woolen throw rests across his lap, embroidered with the family crest and a quote from Cicero. Something about virtue and rest, you assume. He's joined by a few of his imagined friends, names he's probably dropped at dinner like oversized cufflinks. Gentlemen of letters, perhaps, or club acquaintances. There's no conversation, just the shuffle of newspapers, the tink of teaspoons, and the odd MMM of approval over something printed 2 days ago. And then the heads begin to tilt, ever so slightly. One by one, they nap. This wasn't laziness, it was ritual. It was important for a Victorian man of leisure to look just busy enough to avoid sloth, but just restful enough to suggest the weight of the world required frequent, mind pauses. Think of it as power napping in a monocle. Mainstream historians agree. Napping was culturally endorsed among the upper class, especially if it occurred between structured tasks. If you'd met with your solicitor, studied Virgil, and stared blankly at a map of Mesopotamia, then by all means lie down, just not in your bed. That would imply a lack of control. You shift in the doorway as your host lightly dozes. One hand rests on his lap. The other still grips the handle of a teacup, empty for at least an hour. A small thread of drool appears and is reabsorbed by his mustache with military precision. Historians still argue whether these club-style naps were rooted in true fatigue, social mimicry, or simply a way to avoid awkward conversation. The line between rest and performance was always blurry. Some clubs even provided communal nightshirts, washed weekly, one hopes, and special reclining chairs that adjusted with a crank for preferred degrees of gentlemanly surrender. In country houses, such environments were recreated on a smaller scale. Men would retreat to libraries not to read, but to pretend to read while engaging in slow, deliberate napping. One particularly efficient gentleman would open a volume of Gibbon, place a single bookmark 3 pages in, and fall instantly asleep. Upon waking, he'd move the bookmark back to the beginning, claiming he needed to savor the density. You, meanwhile, tiptoe past a cracked door and discover a miniature version of this repose ritual playing out with remarkable fidelity. The gentleman's head tilts. His breathing slows. A single log crackles in the fireplace, scenting the air faintly with cedar and ambition. Then comes the snore. It's not aggressive. It's not even consistent. It's more like a philosophical suggestion of snoring, something between a hum and a regret. And just like that, the spell is broken. He wakes, adjusts his dressing gown, pretends not to notice the nap at all. You see, in polite society, napping was never referred to as such. A gentleman might say he had closed his eyes for contemplation, or engaged in passive digestion. To sleep outright was base, but to hover near sleep, to dance at the edge of consciousness while maintaining impeccable posture, now that was aristocratic. After all, rest was not rest, it was a statement. You rested because you deserved it, because your thoughts were heavy, your responsibilities silent but vast, and your shoes inexplicably tight. There's something unintentionally funny about it, too. The way they all went to such effort to make unconsciousness seem intentional. You think of modern nappers curled on couches, head tilted, mouth open. Now imagine those same people insisting they were deep in strategic repose. That's the Victorian vibe. As the gentleman rises, refreshed, or at least slightly less crumpled, you notice a small ritual. He brushes imaginary lint from his lap, adjusts a button that was already straight, and clears his throat with the mild pomp of someone about to give a speech at a dinner no one invited him to. It's all part of the act. Waking must be dignified, even from a pretend nap. The room returns to stillness. A clock ticks once. The fire crackles again. But something has shifted. The gentleman is upright, alert, ready. For what, you wonder? Why? For the next nap, of course. You trail the gentleman now as he moves with newfound energy, or at least the ceremonial version of it, down a narrow hallway lined with oil paintings of ancestors who all appear mildly disappointed. He's refreshed, robe neatly tied, and his slippers make no sound against the carpeted floor. He's heading for a place few outsiders ever saw, the most sacred room in any Victorian gentleman's house, his sleeping chamber, not to be confused with a bedroom, which anyone might have. A sleeping chamber implies a deliberate, curated, sleep-specific experience, one complete with its own etiquette, architectural quirks, and personal anxieties. As the door swings open, you step into what looks more like a museum exhibit than a room meant for unconsciousness. First impressions. The ceiling is high, perhaps unnecessarily so. Heavy curtains smother every hint of light. A fireplace glows faintly, despite it being June. There's a faint scent of lavender sachets and last century's cologne. And then there's the bed, a looming four-poster beast of dark walnut and billowing damask drapery, large enough to host a treaty negotiation. The Victorian gentleman treated his sleep chamber with the same gravitas he reserved for Parliament, dinner parties, and Latin quotations. It was a room that signaled not just wealth but taste. A well-appointed sleep space was a symbol. Here rests a man of principle, digestion, and possibly gout. You survey the details. A water carafe rests on a side table, covered by a tiny embroidered doily. The windows are double-shuttered to block both noise and moonlight. One corner of the room holds a washstand, its porcelain basin gleaming beside a pitcher of ice-cold water, cold being the preferred temperature, for reasons no one has ever adequately explained. Perhaps to awaken the senses, perhaps to punish them. Mainstream historical records tell us that many elite gentlemen customized their bedrooms to suit personal sleep theories. Some lined the walls with cork to muffle sound. Others slept with windows cracked open in all weather, believing fresh air cured melancholia. One famous magistrate slept with a dish of onions under his bed to purify dreams. Another placed a taxidermy owl near his pillow for wisdom. You do you, sir. Historians still debate whether these rituals were genuine attempts at self-care or elaborate performances of moral superiority. After all, sleep wasn't just a biological need. It was considered character revealing. The ideal man fell asleep easily, but not lazily. He slept deeply, but not indulgently. He woke early, preferably quoting Pliny. And so, the bedroom was engineered for maximum moral alignment. For a mattress, sign of discipline. Iron bed frame, a hygienic choice to avoid the dreaded bed bugs of the soft class. Linen color, white or cream, nothing garish. Pattern quilts, acceptable if imported and mentioned in one's letters. You watch as the gentleman removes his slippers, folds his dressing gown with a reverence usually reserved for relics, and sits on the edge of the bed. There's a small box on the nightstand. He opens it, revealing a set of earplugs made of beeswax and lamb's wool, tucked in beside a tiny tin of lip salve for nocturnal desiccation. That's fancy talk for dry mouth, or perhaps midnight lip theatrics. Then there's the blanket layering. This is not chaos. This is choreography. There's the sheet, crisp, cooled on the sill. Then the underblanket, quilted cotton, followed by the main coverlet, French, possibly unnecessary. And finally, a weighted woolen throw emblazoned with a crest that likely doesn't belong to him. The gentleman tucks himself in like a scone on a silver tray. Here, in this temple of personal routine, you see sleep not as rest, but as a ritual, one practiced, performed, and preserved through decades of subtle refinement. And still, there are final steps. On the wall, a clock, but not one that ticks loudly. No, this one emits a soft purr, like a cat with a background in timekeeping. Near the bed, a bell cord. Pull once for water, twice for an urgent cup of cocoa. And on the gentleman's nightstand, a book, a handkerchief, and a tiny journal labeled incubations. That journal, you suspect, is where the real magic happens. You peek as he opens to a fresh page. Tonight's entry is brief. Dreamt of bees in the wallpaper. May indicate financial anxiety. Avoid cinnamon. He closes the book with a sigh, douses the candle, and slides fully beneath the covers. You think it's over. You really do. But then crinkle. The gentleman adjusts himself. Again, a pillow's not quite right. The sheet has folded beneath his leg at an angle he finds metaphysically troubling. A thread tickles his neck. It's unclear whether he's truly annoyed or simply upholding the sacred right of pre-sleep fussing, a nearly universal behavior among Victorian gentlemen. Eventually, finally, he settles. The room is still. The fire hisses in the grate. The air is faintly scented with something botanical, possibly rosemary and mild insecurity. You hear his breathing even out. His eyelids flutter shut. He's drifting. For real this time. And then, softly, he murmurs something. I think the left curtain is too bold. You let out a breath. He's gone. Into the quiet, curated chaos of his dreams. Into some well-appointed subconscious, where everything smells like cedar and expectations. Into sleep, Victorian style, rigid, fussed over, and just slightly too decorative for its own good. Just as you're about to drift off yourself, lulled by the gentleman's careful layering of blankets and cryptic dream murmurs, a gentle clang rings out from the hallway. Not a sudden noise, more like the kind of sound that's meant to be heard, but only barely acknowledged. It's the warming pan. Ah yes, the unsung hero of Victorian sleep culture. You peek through the cracked door as a valet glides in with military grace, holding what appears to be a long-handled brass instrument full of glowing coals. The man moves with the solemn dignity of someone entrusted with sacred duties, not waking the master, not scorching the sheets, and most importantly, not dying of accidental immolation. The warming pan is slid expertly beneath the covers, drawn down slowly, and removed again with a flick. The sheets now radiate the soft, womb-like heat of someone else's labor. It's a strange blend of comfort and class distinction, because, of course, Victorian gentlemen didn't just get into bed. They entered it like royalty arriving at court. This ritual of warming beds wasn't just about comfort. Mainstream historical sources show it was tied to health beliefs. Cold beds were thought to provoke rheumatism, bad dreams, or, according to one alarmed physician, a wandering of the liver. Warmth, meanwhile, symbolized moral order. One doctor even claimed that properly warmed beds prevented melancholic spiritual excess, which may or may not mean having opinions after midnight. And it wasn't just the bed. You glance around and spot a small cloth sacked by the gentleman's pillow, an herbal pillow sachet, lavender, rose petals, maybe a dash of chamomile or crushed marjoram. These weren't scented for pleasure. They were medicinal, at least in theory. Victorian men sincerely believed that what they inhaled during sleep shaped the purity of their dreams. Sweet dreams were virtuous. Nightmares, obviously, were a sign you'd been reading the wrong poets. But it's not just about smell. It's about sound, too. The fireplace crackles. Outside, you hear the faint rattle of a horse-drawn cart on cobblestones, someone delivering milk or maybe scandal. Inside, there's an odd hum. The gentleman, now almost asleep, has insisted on what he calls a soothing engine. It's a curious contraption, a wind-up music box playing an extremely slow waltz, possibly in a minor key. He listens not for the melody, but for the mechanism. That faint ticking, that turning of gears. It's a lullaby for the industrial age. Historians still argue whether this habit of low mechanical noise was calming or simply a reflection of a society that was now addicted to machines even in their sleep. Either way, Victorian sleep wasn't silent. It was scored. And now, finally, he seems gone. You sit in the dark and wonder how much effort just went into this man's rest. We're 7 sections in, and he hasn't even finished a full REM cycle yet. But perhaps that was the point. For the Victorian gentleman, sleep wasn't passive. It was an event scheduled, studied, customized. If he slept poorly, he wrote about it. If he slept well, he bragged. And if he dreamed of something he didn't like, he blamed the cook. You glance toward the nightstand. A second journal rests beside the dream log. This one's labeled Sleep Observations. Apparently, some gentlemen took notes on themselves. One entry you peek at reads, "Felt restless. Suspect influence of parsnip soup. Must write to Dr. Lansing." The fusion of sleep and science was common in this era. Men read treatises on slumber as if preparing for exams. One popular theory held that thoughts during the day must be tidied before bed, or they would multiply during sleep like gremlins. Thus, journaling, reading dull material, and refusing to speak after 9 p.m. became part of the nightly purification routine. Another theory, far stranger, claimed that lying with one's head pointing north aligned the blood with the Earth's magnetic field. There were actual compasses in bedrooms. You look under the gentleman's pillow. Yes, there's a compass. It's ivory-handled and monogrammed. Of course it is. All this begs the question, were they really sleeping better? Or were they just trying harder? Historians remain divided. Sleep diaries from the era show chronic insomnia, frequent nocturnal awakenings, and a long list of strange remedies. Some men swore by rubbing vinegar on their feet. Others placed potatoes beneath their mattresses. One Scottish baronet reportedly hired a violinist to play a single note repeatedly for 20 minutes before bed. The note, G sharp. Why? Unknown. You return to the present moment. The gentleman sighs gently in his sleep. He has now assumed what one 19th century etiquette manual called the moral position. On his right side, one hand over heart, the other near the candle, just in case he wishes to write poetry at 3 a.m. He probably will. And then, as if on cue, his mouth twitches. He mutters, "Note to self, relocate the asparagus." Yes, he is deep within the Victorian dreamscape now. It's probably filled with impossible gardens, long-forgotten Greek etymologies, and unspoken debts. There are likely carriages made of gold filigree and mysterious ladies named Persephone who speak only in riddles about taxes. The air smells faintly of port wine and pencil shavings. In this dream, the gentleman walks confidently. Everyone knows his name, and no one questions his choices. Not even when he insists the moon must be polished. You sit with him, in the dark, bearing witness to this effortful elegance. Because this was sleep, to the Victorian man. Not surrender, but ceremony. Not rest, but performance. Every sigh, every adjustment, every dream journal entry, it all spoke to a deeper truth. If you could master your nights, maybe, just maybe, you'd survive your days. The clock on the mantel lets out a delicate ting. Just once. A chime so quiet it sounds almost embarrassed to exist. But it's enough. The gentleman stirs again. Slowly, elegantly, if one can describe the act of half-waking with a face like a crumpled linen napkin as elegant. You watch as one eye opens, unfocused, then the other. A sigh, a long blink, and then he sits upright with the grace of a man who thinks someone may be sketching him. It's time for the pre-dawn ponder, because for many Victorian gentlemen, nighttime wasn't just for rest. It was also prime thinking real estate, the hour between 4 and 5 a.m., that sacred liminal window when the world hovered between sleep and action, was considered ideal for reflection, philosophical thought, letters to editors, unsolicited essays on the dangers of trousers made from mixed fabrics. And so here he is, reaching for his pen, not with urgency. No, this is a ritual. The pen is uncapped, a fresh sheet of thick, textured paper laid flat. He scratches his beard, then begins to write, slowly, deliberately, with pauses so long you begin to wonder if he's lost his place. He hasn't. He's savoring the moment. This is not a diary entry. This is a moral memorandum. In the Victorian imagination, moral clarity was best achieved in solitude. And even better, sleepy solitude. The pre-dawn hour was ideal because the mind had not yet been polluted by the newspaper, conversation, or breakfast. What better time to decide whether one's cousin truly deserves that inheritance? Mainstream historical accounts reveal a peculiar truth. Many of the era's political and literary figures did their best work while half asleep. Charles Darwin allegedly took twilight walks in his garden before sunrise, composing paragraphs in his head. Lord Byron claimed to have written entire stanzas of verse before rising, although most of them were, admittedly, about trousers. But while the great minds wrote poems and treatises, your average Victorian gentleman wrote lists. You peek at the page. Things to inquire about. Whether the fishmonger is trustworthy. Whether dreams of fire mean ambition or merely indigestion. Whether cufflinks can be too persuasive. It's not exactly Shakespeare, but it's sincere. That's the key. Victorian men believed in introspection as hygiene. If you didn't regularly assess your moral alignment, your thoughts would grow unruly, like ivy over a library window. You glance toward the window now. A faint gray line slices the dark. Morning is inching closer. The gentleman takes notice, too. His quill slows. He reads over what he's written, nods once, folds the page, and slips it into a small wooden box beside the bed. It's locked with a key shaped like a lyre. You have no idea why. This isn't the first time he's done this. It's part of the schedule, a sleep chapter all its own, a sort of spiritual bookkeeping. And now comes the next layer. Stretching. Yes, stretching. Not calisthenics. Not yoga. Just extremely slow, deliberate arm extensions, followed by a full body sigh that lasts long enough to qualify as theatrical. Victorian men had very specific beliefs about bodily movement in the early hours. Stretching was seen as a way to realign the limbs after a night of moral reflection and woolen entrapment. It was believed to aid digestion, encourage upright posture, and, most importantly, prevent melancholia. One popular medical pamphlet even recommended 7 specific stretches, performed in this order: the gentleman's reach, the conflicted pelican, the sideward nod of regret, the waistcoat surrender, the silent apology, the mirror of self-doubt, the applause of the spine. Only 3 of these were medically sound. The rest sound like performance art for sad owls. You watch as the gentleman attempts a few of these in his own improvised order. He winces. There's a subtle creak. Something in his shoulder makes a noise like a distant door closing. Still, he continues. It's not about comfort, it's about routine. Historians still debate. whether this pre-dawn ritual was a sign of genuine mental discipline or merely a socially sanctioned way to delay getting out of bed. But whatever the truth, the ritual mattered. Victorian gentlemen did not simply wake up. They emerged, like operatic sunflowers, with trust funds. He's sitting up fully now. A glass of water is sipped, not gulped, and the drapes are opened by half an inch. Just enough to acknowledge that the sun might be considering a return. Not enough to admit it's really morning. And then, the strangest part of all, the mirror conversation. You follow him to a small vanity. Ornate. Overly so. A silver-handled brush rests beside a single stick of wax for mustache shaping and, of course, a mirror. The gentleman stares into it. He doesn't smile. He doesn't frown. He regards himself the way one might appraise an old photograph of an enemy's better-dressed cousin. Then he speaks. Well, you didn't die in your sleep. Let's see if you make it through tea. Is he joking? Possibly. Is he serious? Probably not. But for Victorian men, this kind of grim half-humor was common. Waking up was seen as a surprise. Not because they were ill, but because they were constantly anxious about mortality, legacy, and the general fragility of the human liver. He continues. No new boils. Excellent. And the eyebrow appears to have calmed down. You suspect he says something like this every morning. Not because it helps, but because it creates continuity. In an age where control was prized above all else, these small rituals, the writing, the stretching, the mirror chats, were like tiny sandbags against the flood of uncertainty. And now he prepares to go back to sleep. Yes, really, because this was Victorian segmented sleep, another strange belief, and a true one, backed by diaries, letters, and household records. Men often woke for an hour or more during the night, only to return to bed again, resuming what was known as second sleep. They treated it not as insomnia, but as an intermission, a chance to reflect, snack, or be quietly haunted by their debts. Your gentleman yawns, deeply, the kind of yawn that stretches the jaw and temporarily resets one's entire personality. He walks back to bed, rearranges the pillow with a sigh that says, "This is both my burden and my joy," and slides back under the blankets. This time, he sleeps like someone who's earned it, because in a way he has. The house is utterly still again. You remain by the fireplace, wrapped in the muffled quiet that only occurs after someone has voluntarily gone back to sleep. The clock doesn't chime this time, it hums. Outside, the sky has surrendered entirely to pre-dawn blue, the kind that looks cold even when it's warm. Inside, the gentleman is buried once again in the folds of tradition, embroidered linen, and sheer commitment to nightly ceremony. Now we enter what Victorians would call the second sleep, or as your gentleman's grandmother might have called it, the honest rest. This was not the light drifting off of post-dinner weariness. No, this was deliberate re-entry into slumber after thoughtful interruption. And here's the odd part. It wasn't considered strange at all. Mainstream historical records, from rural diaries to medical texts, consistently reference this two-part sleep structure, especially among the upper classes. The first period of rest usually began between 9 and 10 p.m., followed by a period of wakefulness between 2 and 4 a.m., then a second sleep until morning. Many people use that in-between time to pray, write letters, stoke fires, or, as you've witnessed, debate the emotional resonance of their bedsheets. The gentleman now lies completely still, but it's not the stillness of exhaustion. It's staged tranquility. He's placed himself in a precise position, left leg slightly bent, chin turned to the window, arms resting lightly on the coverlet, one hand curled loosely around a silk bookmark. You suspect this pose has been practiced, maybe even rehearsed. Second sleep was often where dreams became more vivid. In fact, some 19th century thinkers, amateur psychologists, philosophers, and that one baker from Leeds who published a pamphlet on lunar-induced hallucinations believed second sleep was closer to true dreaming. The mind, they said, was finally settled, no longer tethered to the day's leftover concerns. Free to conjure. You wonder what he's dreaming now. It's probably something practical, like an imaginary breakfast featuring 17 types of jam and a discussion about waistcoat taxation. Or perhaps he's wandering a softly lit gallery where all the portraits nod approvingly. Or, as one Victorian dream interpreter once suggested, he might be receiving symbolic advice from a fox in a waistcoat, standard stuff. A curious footnote from that era. Certain gentlemen trained themselves to re-enter the same dream night after night, believing it would eventually complete itself and reveal profound personal truth. It never did, of course, but the attempt, that's the most Victorian part of all. You look down now and notice something odd. The gentleman has left one boot on. Why? You may well ask. It turns out there was a belief, niche, but passionately held, that keeping one item of clothing on while sleeping helped anchor the soul. Others claimed it was a method to prevent oversleeping. Still others said it was to keep the foot warm and discourage dreams of drowning. Historians still argue whether this tradition was superstition, social signaling, or simply the result of being too tired to finish undressing. And now that you're paying attention, you see something else. A small velvet pouch tucked under the pillow. Inside, a teaspoon of sugar. Why? Not for emergencies, but because it was thought to attract sweet dreams, both metaphorically and possibly via insects. That part was less intentional. Some men even placed drops of essential oils on the pillow corners, lavender, bergamot, or, for those of a bolder disposition, eucalyptus. The scent wasn't just for comfort. It was believed to direct the tone of your dreams. You inch closer and note his breathing. Steady, shallow, the kind of rhythm that lulls those around him. In this second sleep, he's no longer bothered by curtain boldness or the political leanings of his footmen. This sleep is deeper, quieter, and less performative. There's something oddly touching about it. This was a man who choreographed every step of his bedtime routine, who required 5 pieces of furniture just to undress, who composed philosophical questions about the moral character of jam. And yet here he lies, completely still, briefly unburdened, beautifully ordinary. You think about how much effort has gone into making this moment possible. The velvet slippers, the warming pan, the beeswax earplugs, the journal entries, the mirror pep talk, the stretches named after ambiguous birds. It's an entire ecosystem designed not just to invite sleep, but to control it, to domesticate it like a fox in a drawing room. And somehow it works. Historians note that despite all the fuss, many Victorian gentlemen did report a sense of restfulness after segmented sleep. The very structure of it, the interruption, the quiet moment of reflection, and the return to bed, seemed to enhance their clarity in the morning. Some even insisted that second sleep was when their best ideas arrive. Unfiltered wisdom, one wrote, comes only after tea is impossible and before trousers are required. But of course, this sleep system came with pressure too. Gentlemen were expected to rest well, to dream decently, to wake up composed. The morning face of a proper Victorian man was supposed to reflect a night of moral calm, not tangled sheets and ghost anxiety. If you looked tired, it wasn't just a sign of insomnia. It was a hint at spiritual disorder. You glance again at the bed. He's turned over now, facing the wall, still asleep. One boot still on. The candle beside him has burned low. A trail of wax has curved into a comma-shaped puddle on the nightstand. You imagine a valet discovering it later and interpreting it as some symbolic omen. Ah yes, Sir dreamed of delay. Best not serve herring today. You smile. This is Victorian sleep, absurd, elegant, exhausting, and somehow effective. For all its rules, it gave the gentleman what he needed. A pocket of silence, a moment to forget who he was. A world with no rules, but the ones he chose to invent. And tomorrow when he wakes, he'll insist it was the pillow. Dawn has fully arrived now. Not a dramatic sunrise. This is England, after all, but a sort of slow, apologetic illumination that gently slips between the curtains. The gray light creeps across the carpet like a butler who's just remembered he left the tea caddy unlocked. The gentleman is still asleep, curled into an improbably compact shape that suggests either profound peace or a cramp forming in real time. But not for long, because in a Victorian gentleman's home, morning is an obligation. You hear it first, the whisper of movement down the hallway, a soft clink of porcelain, the faint groan of old floorboards protesting the burden of yet another breakfast tray. The household is waking, and with it, so too must its most curated sleeper. And indeed, as the light creeps across his nose, the gentleman stirs. Not with a start, never with a start. He wakes the way you might imagine a small theater curtain lifting, slow, deliberate, and with the unmistakable air of someone who expects applause for the effort. He sits up, blinks twice, and exhales the sigh of a man already dreading telegrams. Welcome to the Victorian wake-up procedure, a routine as nuanced and deeply strange as the sleep that preceded it. The first step, immediate facial assessment. Victorian men were taught that the state of their face upon waking was a kind of spiritual weather report. A fresh complexion meant purity of heart. Puffy eyes? Moral excess. A furrowed brow. Poor digestion, or worse, unresolved feelings about modern fencing etiquette. The gentleman glances in his mirror and mutters, "Could be worse." That's considered an optimistic assessment. Next, oral hygiene, or what passed for it. He reaches for a cup on the nightstand, swishes with diluted vinegar, and chews briefly on a piece of dried mint leaf. Toothpaste exists, but only in the form of questionable powders made of chalk, cuttlefish bone, and crushed porcelain. He wisely avoids it this morning. One can only embrace so much enamel erosion before breakfast. Then comes the bed exit, and this is crucial, no sudden movements. A Victorian man leaves his bed like a gentleman disembarks from a canoe, carefully, maintaining balance, aware that socks may be watching. He stretches again. The applause of the spine makes a dignified return. And then, slippers on, robe refastened. He stands fully, upright, awake, kind of. You notice his posture, erect but vaguely cautious. There's a strange expectation in the air, like he might be tested at any moment on his Latin or bloodline, because in many ways, a gentleman's morning routine was designed to reassemble his identity. During sleep, he may have dreamed of nonsense, floating tea sets, political swans, or speaking with his second-best waistcoat, but now it's time to return to the serious business of being himself. He moves to the washstand. Ah yes, the cold water splash ritual. A bowl of water, often chilled overnight on the windowsill, awaits him. He plunges his face into it with the resigned grace of a man who once tried this while hungover and never fully forgave himself. Cold water, they believed, stimulated the senses and clarified thought. It was also seen as a way to defeat morning sinfulness, which apparently lurked near the nostrils. After patting his face dry with a monogram towel, initials too large, frankly, he reaches for his grooming kit. And oh, what a kit it is. A silver-handled brush, a tin of mustache wax, scissors small enough to intimidate ants, something labeled brow water. You decide not to ask. As he grooms, he hums something, a baritone attempt at a popular ballad, or possibly the death march for his sideburns. Historians still debate whether Victorian men actually enjoyed this grooming process, or merely feared what would happen if they skipped it. For many, looking composed was considered a moral duty. One etiquette guide warned, "The disheveled brow is a window into disorder. Comb it, or shame your lineage." You look toward the corner of the room, where his valet has quietly entered to lay out clothing. And here begins the next trial, wardrobe selection. Now, this isn't a matter of picking between two ties. This is a layered crisis. First, drawers. Then long underpants, flannel, seasonally appropriate. Then the shirt. Then the waistcoat. Then the other waistcoat. Yes, really. Then the collar, the cravat, the jacket, the pocket square, and finally, an outer coat, depending on the barometric pressure and level of societal scrutiny anticipated at breakfast. You watch him struggle briefly with the stubborn button. He mutters something about the conspiracy of thread and reaches for a tiny button hook, because of course he has one. By the time he's fully dressed, he looks immaculate and slightly exhausted. Victorian morning wear was not designed for comfort. It was designed for credibility. You follow him to the window now. He pulls aside the curtain just enough to see the street. A horse cart rumbles by. A boy with newspapers shouts something unintelligible. He watches, sipping tea that has appeared as if by magic, though more likely delivered silently by someone who's been up since 5 a.m. He stands there, gazing out at the city. at the factory smoke curling above rooftops, at the carriages, the chimney sweeps, the lace shop on the corner that recently expanded. His posture says, I have thoughts about all this. But his eyes say, I'd rather be dreaming about asparagus negotiations. And just when you think the moment is over, when the routine is complete and the gentleman is now fully a daylight version of himself, he surprises you. He turns to his writing desk, removes his dream journal, and under the final entry, note, Fox with monocle says beware parsley. He adds 3 more words. Sleep, adequate. Pursue again. And with that, he closes the book, stands, adjusts his cuffs, and walks toward the parlor. The day has officially begun. The gentleman's footsteps fade as he exits the bedroom, his boots clicking softly like punctuation on polished wood. You remain behind, alone now, in a room that's been thoroughly slept in, thought through, and, in its own strange way, spiritually exorcised. But you're not done yet, because in the world of Victorian sleep, the real test isn't how a gentleman sleeps, it's how he talks about it the next day. Later that morning, seated in his study with a copy of the Times, your gentleman will be asked casually by a visiting colleague, Did you rest well, old boy? He will respond with a sigh, a tilt of the head, and a statement so circuitously vague it requires subtitles. Fitfully, but with curious intermissions of clarity. There was some mild bell ringing, I think. This is not an unusual response. In Victorian England, sleep was narrated. Men shared their dreams the way modern influencers post their breakfast. But not just the dreams, also the quality of the mattress, the direction of the wind, the degree of silence, the philosophical implications of a creaking floorboard at 2:17 a.m. And when it came to reporting on sleep, there was an unspoken code. Understate everything, unless it involved weather, in which case exaggerate with passion. You glance over the gentleman's dream journal again. Today's post-sleep notation reads, 2 3/4 hours prior to intermission. Strange image of a hedgehog in bishop's robes. Suspect symbolic. There's a column for atmosphere, he's written. Hushed, with occasional threat. 1 for bed warmth, optimistic. And 1 titled mental clarity upon waking, under which he has drawn a single question mark. Victorian men didn't just log sleep for amusement. Many sincerely believed they could analyze their slumber the way one might parse scripture. Was the dream brief? Was it recurring? Was it provoked by something impure, like an argument or an undercooked onion tart? Mainstream historical records show a rise in sleep-tracking behaviors during the 1840s, 60s, especially among middle and upper-class men who had been influenced by the intersecting currents of spiritualism, early psychology, and gaslight-related paranoia. And yes, gaslights did play a role in dreams. The gentleman, like many of his peers, insists on extinguishing all visible flames before bed, not out of fear of fire necessarily, but because of the belief that certain types of light stimulated unnatural thought. Candlelight was considered warm and poetic. Gaslight, on the other hand, was said to agitate the mind and lead to chaotic, even licentious, dreams. One pamphlet referred to gaslight-induced sleep as the flickering trance of moral ambiguity, which is exactly the kind of phrase the gentleman would love to quote at dinner. Speaking of which, dreams were also a common conversation starter, especially at breakfast, and particularly among men who fancied themselves amateur Freud prototypes before Freud even existed. You imagine him now, seated at a formal breakfast table, buttering toast with unnecessary elegance, and saying, I dreamed last night of an opera in which everyone wore hats shaped like regrets. A younger gentleman, perhaps a nephew or impressionable guest, might ask, Do you think it means anything? And the answer would likely be, Of course, but it's dreadfully vulgar to interpret oneself before noon. Historians still debate whether Victorians took their dreams too seriously, or simply used them as an acceptable vehicle for intimacy, a way to confess vulnerabilities or poetic whims under the soft excuse of just a dream. There's also the peculiar matter of dream manuals. You spot one now on the bookshelf. Reveries Decoded, a practical guide to spiritual rest. Its chapters include Of Birds and Fences, Navigating Anxiety with Avian Symbols, damp landscapes as harbingers of regret. On dreaming of Frenchmen, probable causes and consequences, the gentleman has bookmarked a chapter titled Objects That Float Unreasonably. According to these manuals, certain dream elements were tied to very specific meanings. To dream of rain meant money was coming, unless the rain was sideways, in which case, emotional betrayal. To dream of an old friend with a different nose meant someone in your life was hiding the truth. Dreaming of chess, either a call to strategy or a warning to stop overthinking your investments. You wonder how often he consulted this book, judging by the wear on the spine, often enough to consider it part of a morning routine. And of course, all this dream talk had one final purpose: status. Victorian men wanted it known that their minds were active even while unconscious. They wanted to be the sort of person who dreams in full sentences, who wakes up mid-epiphany, who solves architectural flaws with nocturnal revelations. One prominent barrister claimed his best legal ideas arrived between the third and fifth yawn. Another insisted he never dreamed at all, which, among his peers, was considered either very suspicious or deeply admirable. And what of nightmares? Oh, those were a different matter entirely. Nightmares were embarrassing, not because they were scary, but because they implied a lack of inner composure. Real men, according to several guides, either dreamed of grand contemplations or of nothing at all. If you admitted to having a nightmare, you had to disguise it with metaphor. You couldn't say, "I dreamed I was chased by wolves." You had to say, "I experienced an allegory of economic anxiety through lupin imagery." Even the gentleman himself, who is fairly secure in his social station, won't admit to dreams involving clowns, open water, or public poetry readings. Instead, he phrases it as, "Last night was somewhat impressionistic." You return now to his bedroom, sun fully up, linens folded back, the warming pan long gone. His sleep, for all its ceremony and scrutiny, is already being tidied into narrative. It's not just about rest, it's about storytelling. Sleep is a scene, and the gentleman is both actor and critic. He'll spend the day pondering it all. The odd image of that monocled fox, the strangely unsettling dream about misaddressed envelopes, the feeling, however faint, that his soul wandered a bit too far from the boot he left on. He'll write it down, file it, possibly cross-reference it with weather patterns and last night's supper. Because in the end, sleep for the Victorian gentleman wasn't a break from life. It was part of the performance. Back in the bedroom, the morning sun has claimed the room entirely. It drapes the floorboards in slanted rectangles and glints off brass bedposts and silver brushes. The bed is unmade, but not messy. It's the kind of deliberate disorder that whispers, "A gentleman did sleep here," but with composure. The staff are already at work. Somewhere downstairs, porridge simmers. In the hallway, a maid flutters past with a stack of freshly ironed cravats. And beside the window, a valet silently folds a dressing gown with surgical precision. The house is busy again, but this section of the day, just after waking and before engagement, is precious, because now comes the ritual of the morning nap. Yes, you heard that right. Victorian gentlemen, especially those who didn't work in traditional office hours or didn't work at all, often carved out yet another pocket of rest in the form of a post-wake nap. It wasn't sloth, it was restorative reflection. That's what they called it. You know, to keep it respectable. The logic went like this. After the strenuous mental effort of dressing, journaling, stretching, and overseeing the delivery of toast, a gentleman required a short window, 20 to 45 minutes, to close his eyes and realign with the self. In practice, this looked a lot like dozing in an armchair while pretending to think about parliamentary reform. You find our gentleman doing exactly that now. He has relocated to a deep velvet chair by the study window. A tasseled blanket rests across his lap. His newspaper droops in one hand. His face has adopted that rare expression of a man who insists he's thinking, but is definitely halfway through a nap. And for good reason. The Victorian day, though seemingly slow-paced, involved an exhausting number of social obligations, silent rivalries, and deeply competitive letter writing. So this little nap wasn't just indulgent. It was survival. Mainstream medical thinking of the time often encouraged these short bursts of midday rest, especially for men of nervous temperament. A polite umbrella term that covered everything from mild anxiety to existential dread brought on by spotting an uneven doormat. A popular guidebook titled The Modern Gentleman's Inner Hygiene included a chapter titled The Importance of Idle Minutes, in which it stated, "Let not the industrious mock the restful, for the mind, like a mustache, must occasionally be allowed to relax its curl." Your gentleman subscribes to this philosophy wholeheartedly, but he doesn't just fall asleep wherever. No, the nap has form. First, he sprinkles a few drops of a homemade lavender tonic onto his lapel. Not for scent. He claims it cools the temples via the lap. Historians still argue whether that's anatomical nonsense or a poetic metaphor that got out of hand. Next, he positions a small footstool beneath one ankle and balances a cushion under the opposite elbow. His head rests against the chair back at a precise 37-degree angle, which he believes aligns the spine for optimal vision-based dreaming. He insists this angle once helped him envision an entire patent for a glove that also sharpens pencils. The patent, sadly, was not accepted. As he naps, the room grows quiet again. This isn't full sleep. Not quite. It's that blissful space between awareness and dream. A drifting, meditative state often described by Victorian men as draping the mind in velvet. Of course, a few also described it as dream fencing without consequences, which is both poetic and concerning. You step closer. The gentleman's face is soft, unguarded, free of the practiced expressions he wears when talking about boilers or monocles. This is the real him. He's not planning his afternoon wardrobe. He's not rewriting the letter he sent to the Gentleman's Review, protesting the use of the phrase modern napkin. He's simply letting his thoughts wander, and what thoughts they are. Historians have recovered personal letters and journals that reveal the odd meanderings Victorian gentlemen confessed to having during these naps. One man imagined he lived inside a grandfather clock and dispensed advice through hourly chimes. Another believed his garden gnome spoke French and was offended by the neighbor's hedge. A third, perhaps the most relatable, simply dreamed of soup. For hours, this kind of productive idleness was encouraged among men of means. It was thought to foster innovation and moral clarity. One medical pamphlet even described the nap as a vessel for the unspoken virtue of pause. And unlike night sleep, the nap had no performance pressure. You didn't have to dream something meaningful. You didn't have to record your mental state. You didn't even have to wake up smarter. All you had to do was drift. Your gentleman stirs now, not with a jolt, but with a slight lift of the chin, as if politely excusing himself from a very quiet party he hosted in his own subconscious. He blinks. He exhales. He folds the newspaper even though he clearly hasn't read a single word. Then he stands. The morning nap is over. He walks slowly across the room to his writing desk, not to work, but to note down something vaguely profound like brief nap. Felt like being a comma in a well-written letter. Then he checks the clock. It's 9:30. Time to begin the next round of scheduled engagements. A modest breakfast, a stroll past the milliner's shop, where he pretends not to look at hats, and a lengthy correspondence exchange with a man in Liverpool about whether umbrellas can be considered masculine architecture. But for now, there's a pause, a quiet, a sense of calm that can only come from having slept 4 separate times in the last 12 hours. And really, that's the lesson here. Victorian sleep wasn't linear. It was layered, a tapestry of stretches, pauses, interruptions, reflections, and polite refusals to accept modern circadian theory. You marvel at how much effort has gone into this illusion of rest. But as he steps out of the study, smoothing his waistcoat and humming an unfinished tune about barley taxation, you can't help but admire it. Because sleep, to a Victorian gentleman, wasn't just rest. It was character. The house has come alive now, gently of course. Victorian homes didn't erupt into activity. They emerged from silence, like steam rising off tea. And as your gentleman descends the staircase, you follow closely, catching the tail end of a whispered "good morning" to the butler. Even greetings, you note, are measured to avoid fatigue. Downstairs, the drawing room is prepared for what comes next, the mid-morning recline. Yes, you counted right. We've had sleep, second sleep, morning wakefulness, and a nap. And now we've arrived at a strange hybrid state, the fully dressed rest. It's too late for pajamas, too early for action. This was where the gentleman looked awake, but wasn't expected to do much. He glides toward a chaise lounge upholstered in something unnecessarily floral, sits down with practiced grace, and pulls a small book from a side table. It's not a novel or philosophy tract. It's a bound pamphlet on the digestive temperament of horses. You assume he finds it relaxing. This moment, reading but not retaining, resting but not sleeping, was important. The Victorian era was obsessed with proper pacing. Too much exertion before noon was seen as vulgar. So men of his class filled this slot in the day with reflective leisure, polishing canes, contemplating garden statuary, or writing unnecessarily long letters to the editor about the moral fiber of teacups. And for some, this was when they prepared for their most sacred daily rite, the afternoon nap. You'd think, given how many sleeping opportunities have already occurred, that another would be excessive. But no, Victorian gentlemen treated sleep like a schedule of appointments. If dreams arrived uninvited, they were noted politely. If they didn't, well, there was always the next nap. This upcoming one would require slightly more effort, because unlike the spontaneous post-wake doze, the afternoon nap was a production, often taken in the library or smoking room. It was framed as a way to restore mental elasticity. The term is meaningless, but it sounded respectable enough to justify 20 minutes of pretending not to snore on a tufted leather chair. Historians still argue whether this nap was about actual fatigue or about social camouflage. After all, if a gentleman didn't feel like answering correspondence or engaging in conversation about turnip tariffs, claiming one was resting his faculties offered a graceful exit. But before that could happen, one needed to create the appropriate conditions. You follow the gentleman to the study, where preparations are underway. First, shade control. Victorian gentlemen were finicky about light. Direct sunlight was thought to overstimulate the brain and invite unedited dreams. So heavy curtains are drawn, leaving the room in a soft gloom that smells faintly of pipe tobacco and overconfidence. Second, set management. He opens a small drawer and withdraws a tiny vial labeled Olfactory Nap Elixir No. 2. It smells like lavender and unresolved ambition. He dabs it lightly onto a linen handkerchief and places it on his chest like a modest corsage. Third, decoy reading material. This nap must look like a study session gone gentle, so he sets an open book in his lap on the varied moods of geese and allows his eyelids to droop with academic elegance. This is not a chaotic collapse into slumber. It's a socially sanctioned fade-out. You observe him now, reclining, arms folded, feet crossed at the ankles. A thin ray of filtered light glances across his cheekbone. He looks like a man whose greatest enemy is the thought of being called idle. It's worth noting that in this period, upper-class men were encouraged to rest in increments, while working-class sleep was often broken involuntarily by shift demands or noise. Sleep became a class marker. To nap by choice was a kind of luxury signaling. I am important enough that the world will wait for me to reawaken. The gentleman twitches slightly, perhaps mid-dream. Victorian napping culture, while widespread, was rarely discussed as sleep. It was more often framed as contemplative withdrawal. That phrase appears in at least 3 etiquette guides, one of which recommends napping while holding a half-read pamphlet to preserve the illusion of unbroken intellectual labor. This nap lasts 27 minutes. Why? Because the gentleman owns a pocket watch with an engraved alarm mechanism. It does not ring. It releases a tiny vibration, a sort of Victorian Fitbit, designed to wake him without disarray. One scholar described it as the least alarming alarm in history. He stirs. Eyes blink open. He exhales slowly and says to no one in particular, A decent pause. And then he resumes reading about geese as if nothing happened. This whole episode, the scent, the posture, the watch, the ritual pause, says everything about Victorian masculinity and its peculiar relationship with effort. You could rest, but it had to look like strategy. Sleep was permitted, as long as it wore a tie. He rises now and walks across the room. refreshed in the only way one can be refreshed, by having not really slept, but deeply pretended to. You glance at his dream journal again, now updated. Nap effective. Dreamed of hosting a dinner party with Queen Victoria and several cabbages. No one spoke. And just below it, emotional clarity, low. Amusing, though. You laugh quietly. Or try not to. He would not approve. But this is the charm of it, isn't it? Sleep to the Victorian gentleman was a drama, complete with acts, costumes, staging, and very few genuine outcomes. It was theater for one, staged nightly and matinee in moderation. And while the world outside ticks on, factory whistles, clattering hooves, the ever-present concern about which monocle suits foggy days best, your gentleman has mastered a private art. He doesn't sleep to escape the day. He sleeps to prepare for it, repeatedly. The afternoon wears on like a well-tailored overcoat. Not fast, not slow, but reassuring in its weight. In most homes across Victorian England, this would be the time for errands, correspondence, or, for the unfortunate, committee meetings about brickwork regulations. But here in the home of our ever-somnolent gentleman, the hours after his afternoon nap are curiously tranquil. He emerges from his study like a man returning from a profound inner voyage, though the only true distance covered was between alertness and a minor goose-themed dream. And now, believe it or not, it's time for tea and the final strategic drowse. Yes, there is still more sleep. Not long ago, an afternoon tea would have been a modest affair. A cup, a biscuit, maybe a letter read aloud. But by the mid-19th century, tea had become an event, and for the gentleman class, it conveniently served as a buffer between their second nap and the more public-facing parts of the evening. You watch him settle into the drawing room. A table has already been laid with military precision. Cucumber sandwiches so symmetrical you wonder if a draftsman was involved. Little cakes wearing icing like embroidered waistcoats. And, of course, a steaming silver pot of Earl Grey strong enough to wake the ancestors. He pours with elegance, pinky respectfully neutral. A friend joins him, another gentleman with the haunted look of a man who owns too many walking sticks and not enough opinions. They sip, they speak. Topics include the poor performance of the orchestra at last Tuesday's charity opera, an argument over whether butter should be salted during odd-numbered months, a polite complaint that someone's new wallpaper is a bit forward, and then the conversation turns to a beloved standby, last night's sleep. Historians have noted that this ritual, recapping the night's rest, was as common at tea tables as jam. Entire volumes of diaries exist where men comment not on politics or family, but the minute details of how they took to bed the previous evening, including how long it took to fall asleep, whether their limbs felt temperate, whether any invisible forces passed judgment upon their dreams. Your gentleman says, "I did not dream last night, but I awoke with the distinct impression that I had been watched, possibly by a chair." His friend nods solemnly and offers a reassuring, "I, too, have known that sensation." But as the tea winds down and the light begins to dim through the lace curtains, something new stirs in the air, a gentle sleepiness that isn't quite napping and isn't quite focus. It's the late afternoon drift. This phase was never formally acknowledged in guidebooks, but many letters and journals suggest that Victorian gentlemen often experienced what they described as mental float around this time of day, a kind of semi-dreaming wakefulness that coincided perfectly with full stomachs and full schedules. The gentleman excuses himself politely. You follow him, not back to bed, not to a study, but to his reading room, a chamber specifically designed for one very odd purpose, intentional, fully conscious near napping. Here, he doesn't lie down. He doesn't undress. He simply selects a deeply boring volume. Today, The Use of Fencing Terms in Poetry, Volume 3, sits in a high-backed chair and reads until his brain starts doing that thing where words become soup. You've done it too. We all have. But to him, this is a noble exercise, because in the Victorian imagination, to flirt with sleep without fully giving in was a sign of cultivated restraint. He was proving he could rest at will, and yet also resist it, like a child sitting in front of a cake and saying, "No, thank you. I shall merely admire the frosting from afar." It's around this time that his valet brings in a fresh cravat and a small card on a tray. Tonight, Your gentleman is expected at a dinner party, one hosted by a viscount who once fell asleep during a lecture and dreamt he was a taxidermied owl. The event promises many fine wines, zero emotional openness, and a dangerous abundance of pudding. And so the preparation begins, not just for the evening's clothing, but for its interrupted sleep. Because here's the catch. Victorian dinner parties often went late. They involved multiple courses, long speeches, and enough port to sink a ferry. And for a man who's already experienced 3 minor sleep phases today, this kind of prolonged wakefulness required strategy. As he selects his evening wear, black coat, polished boots, an unnecessarily tight collar, you notice he places something quietly into his pocket, a mint-scented cloth, used to revive oneself in case of premature drowsiness at the table. You'd think such a thing would be seen as weakness. But no, it was understood, almost honored, among men of his class that sleepiness could strike without warning. Etiquette books even had suggestions for what to do if one dozed during a speech. Nod slowly, as if in agreement. Cough just before slumping. Pretend to have been praying. He practices each of these before heading toward the carriage. Historians still argue whether these sleepy rituals were an extension of Victorian stoicism or simply a charming failure to stay alert in rooms with too much velvet. Either way, there's something oddly moving about it all. Your gentleman doesn't fear sleep. He negotiates with it. He doesn't surrender. He invites it in small doses, like a friend who's only allowed to stay if they behave. And now, as the sun sets fully and the flicker of gaslight returns, you realize something else. Every moment of his day has been a dance with drowsiness, not to defeat it, but to curate it.